On September 15, 1896, over 30,000 people gathered in the Texas countryside to watch two trains smash into each other at full speed. It wasn't an accident. The collision had been planned for months. Tickets were sold, vendors lined the grounds, and newspapers promoted the event across the state. For many spectators, it felt more like attending a fair than witnessing a railroad stunt. Then something went terribly wrong. When the locomotives met, both boilers exploded. Metal fragments tore through the crowd, killing spectators and injuring many more. Within seconds, what had been advertised as a thrilling spectacle became a deadly disaster. This is the story of the crash at Crush. The story begins with a railroad executive named William George Crush. He worked for the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, commonly known as the Katy Railroad, at a time when railroads were locked in fierce competition for passengers and public attention. Every railroad wanted publicity, and Crush had an idea that seemed impossible to ignore. What if people could watch two full-sized steam locomotives collide head-on at high speed? The proposal was outrageous, dangerous, and unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. It also sounded exactly like the kind of event newspapers would talk about for weeks. Railroad officials approved the plan, and preparations began. The company selected an empty stretch of prairie about 15 miles north of Waco, Texas. Then they did something almost unbelievable. They built an entire temporary town to host the event. The site was named Crush, after William Crush himself. Special trains were scheduled to bring visitors from across Texas, while the railroad launched an aggressive advertising campaign promoting the collision. For as little as $2, passengers could purchase round-trip tickets to witness the spectacle. The response exceeded every expectation. On the morning of September 15th, trains began arriving from every direction. Families traveled together, farmers journeyed for hours, and reporters came looking for a story unlike any they had ever covered. By afternoon, between 30 and 40,000 people had gathered around the tracks. At the time, that was roughly the population of a respectable Texas city. The temporary town overflowed with activity as bands played music, vendors sold food and drinks, and crowds wandered the grounds waiting for the main attraction. The railroad selected two steam locomotives for the stunt, renumbering them specifically for the occasion. Locomotive number 999 was painted bright red, while locomotive number 1001 was painted bright green. The contrasting colors would make it easier for spectators to follow the approaching trains. According to the plan, the locomotives would begin several miles apart on the same track. Their throttles would be locked open, allowing them to accelerate toward one another after the signal was given. The crews would jump clear before impact. Railroad officials carefully calculated speeds and distances, believing they had accounted for every variable. Yet several engineers reportedly warned that the boilers might explode during the collision. Those concerns were largely dismissed. Late in the afternoon, spectators moved into position and photographers prepared their cameras. Thousands of people watched in anticipation as William Crush himself rode onto the tracks atop a white horse. Positioning himself between the two locomotives, he raised his hat high above his head. For a brief moment, the crowd fell silent. Then he brought the hat down sharply. The signal had been given. At first, the locomotives rolled forward slowly. Then they gathered speed. Soon, both trains were racing toward each other at nearly 50 miles per hour, creating a combined closing speed approaching 100 miles per hour. Smoke poured from their stacks as the crowd cheered. As the locomotives closed the distance, the excitement became almost unbearable. Hundreds of feet became dozens. Then, with a tremendous roar, the two engines slammed into one another. The collision was everything the crowd expected for a brief moment. Then came the explosions. Both boilers burst with a force far greater than anyone anticipated. Massive fragments of iron shot into the crowd like artillery shells, some traveling hundreds of yards from the point of impact. What had been a celebration only moments earlier transformed into chaos. People screamed and ran as debris rained down around them. 2 people were killed, and several others suffered catastrophic injuries. One victim, a teenager named Ernest Darnell, had climbed a mesquite tree for a better view of the collision. A fragment of iron struck him and killed him instantly. A commercial photographer covering the event was hit in the face by a flying bolt and lost an eye. Others suffered severe wounds as doctors and volunteers rushed to help the injured. Witnesses later described scenes of confusion and horror. The disaster happened so quickly that many spectators didn't immediately understand what had occurred. News of the tragedy spread across the country almost immediately. Newspapers carried dramatic accounts of the explosion, and critics questioned how such a dangerous event had ever been approved. Why had spectators been allowed so close to the tracks? Why had warnings about the boilers been ignored? And who was responsible for what had happened? The railroad quickly found someone to blame. William Crush was fired almost immediately after the disaster. For a while, it appeared that the stunt had destroyed the career of the man who had conceived it. But it worked. When the collision became national news, people who had never heard of the Katy Railroad suddenly knew its name. Railroad executives soon realized something uncomfortable. The event had generated more publicity than they ever could have purchased through traditional advertising. Just days after firing him, the railroad rehired William Crush. His stunt had ended in tragedy, but from a publicity standpoint, it had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. One young observer, ragtime composer Scott Joplin, was inspired to write a piano piece called The Great Crush Collision March, helping preserve the event in popular memory. The temporary town of Crush disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. Within days, much of it was dismantled, and the prairie returned to normal. Yet the story endured. More than a century later, the crash at Crush remains one of the strangest publicity stunts ever attempted, and one of the most infamous railroad spectacles in American history.